Proselytize
or apostatize.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Proselytize or Apostatize podcast. I think I'm going to start calling it the POA pod. How does that sound, David?
It's fine with me, bud.
The POA pod, it kind of sounds like the Pewy pod, but, you know,
don't ever say POS.
POA is a lot easier than saying proselytize or apostatize every time. That gets kind of old, so we're going to do that from now on. I'm Titus. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, the Russell. And we have a very special guest today, all the way across the pond from the United Kingdom. His name is Thomas Newman, and whenever I try to do the British accent, I think it's great, and my American friends think it's great. But if an actual Brit is talking to me, they tell me it's as they say, rubbish, complete rubbish. Is that correct, Thomas?
I think that was from the sort of Dick Van Dyke world of English accents. That one.
It's funny. So I'm sure you know we all think your accent is like the coolest thing since sliced cheese.
Oh, really?
But when I've asked British people if they think that our accent is cool, they generally say no. Is that how you feel?
Well, it's funny because I don't know. Maybe you guys don't hear it, but I've got a Welsh accent, which is so technically I'm not English. So there's a whole bunch of accents over here. So when you get to know them, they all sound a little bit differently. But I get the sense that Americans tend to think we all sound a little bit like Hugh Grant, you know, the actor.
Yeah. Yeah, oh, we all love it. Even if we don't agree with what you guys say, we just like to hear you guys say it, you know? But yeah, Thomas is the producer of a show called Hiding in Plain Sight. And I actually found out about this show on Twitter. I saw Justin Brierley from the Unbelievable program liked one of your tweets. And so started talking to you there on Twitter and started listening to your podcast. And I got to say, man, it is one of my favorite podcasts. I've so enjoyed listening to your first season. And, you know, I'll let you talk a little more about it. But the long and short of it is you are, I believe, an agnostic who went on a little experiment where you visited churches and tried to put yourself in the Christian bubble for a while and kind of chronicled your journey in sort of a documentary style podcast series. And so, yeah, is that kind of a good way to describe what you've done?
Yeah, well, just thanks for the compliments, straight up. I mean, obviously it's good to get some feedback and hear that it goes over well to people who aren't non-believers. Obviously, there was always a fear that I would just piss a bunch of people off, or people would be offended just by the concept of, you know, someone who doesn't believe in God or who isn't a Christian trying on Christians' clothes and walking in Christians' shoes for a little while. I mean, that was my feeling for it. I mean, the reason I did it, probably, you know, the base reason was probably sort of more ego than anything else. I wanted to do something that I thought was creative and was cool, and I liked the idea of doing a podcast. I thought that would be great. So that was kind of my starting point. It was a really selfish one. And then I thought, you know, well, what could I do? What am I interested in? I listened to a lot of that Unbelievable show that you talked about, so I knew about that and some of the debates that was going on around it. And I was interested in that. And for a while, I thought maybe I could contribute to something in that kind of world. But I kind of realized that there was really good stuff going on that was kind of dealing with the belief side of things. And I really wanted to sort of maybe take an angle on how do people find meaning in being a Christian? What are some of the things, if I parked my beliefs for a second, if I sort of, you know, stopped worrying about whether there is a God and stopped sort of falling at the first barrier, if you like, what would happen if I walked beyond that barrier and went to church and instead of sort of getting annoyed or feeling like I wasn't part of it just because I didn't believe in God, how about I actually just got involved, started praying, started reading the Bible? You know, what happened if I did all that stuff? So the show kind of journals me from day one with my friend Rick, who's a Christian, me going in the car with him to church, right the way through to, several months in where, I've been going to church for a while and I've been reading and finding out about Jesus. So it really kind of is just a bit of a fly on the wall take. It's a personal journal and me just letting people know what my thoughts are as I go.
Yeah, I thought it was so fascinating. And one of the things that was interesting to me coming from a non-believer's perspective is that you had nothing but nice things to say about Christians. And we're definitely not used to that. Generally, if someone's coming from that side of the fence, like a Richard Dawkins or a Christopher Hitchens, it's generally polemic. So that definitely caught my attention. And often even from inside the church, at least from my perspective, when I look at what the evangelical church is doing and the impression they're giving to the world, I tend to criticize my own tribe pretty harshly, and I tend to think that, man, we're not really living up to the teachings of Jesus very well. But kind of seeing your experience gave me a lot of hope, and I was like, man, there's some great Christians out there doing some good stuff. So that was just really cool to see.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I'm like, I talk about in the show this idea of like swallowing certain bugs as I go. So I was kind of unapologetically searching for value. So, of course, there's things in it that I experienced that, I would probably leave behind or I wouldn't incorporate into my own life. And there's elements of church life that I might struggle with if I was doing it for, if I was going to become a Christian, for example. But what I wanted to do was really try and search for what are the kind of real nuggets that I could learn from. So, I didn't spend a huge amount of time boring the audience maybe with my view on why, the resurrection might not be something that I can fully believe in, right? Because I feel like there's so many people doing that and so many people talking about that, and there may be some great arguments to have. I wanted to find out, okay, what does the resurrection mean if believed? What does that mean if you think about suffering as something that is part of your journey in life and can be appreciated, and you can find the positive in suffering, and maybe there's some transformation that can come about from suffering? What happens then? So I kind of like deliberately took that sort of search for value to try and see what I could onboard into my life just by taking that slightly tilting my head one way rather than the other to find out what Christianity could offer me in some ways.
Yeah, it seems similar to sort of what Jordan Peterson is doing with kind of avoiding the whole question of if Christianity is literally true or if God literally exists, and kind of looking at the effects of religious belief on human beings and seeing what the positive effects might actually be. And so it seems like you've kind of done something similar there. Yeah,
and also I'd agree with that. I mean, my suspicion with Jordan Peterson is kind of like a quasi-Christian, or he seems like he's some sort of Christianity going on there. Like, whereas for myself, I probably wouldn't describe myself as religious. But and I think one of the reasons, go back to your question about why I had so many good things upon reflection to say about Christianity. I think I didn't really get to the point where I was having conversations that were maybe polarized. So I didn't get into the kind of gay rights conversation. I didn't get into the gender conversation. I didn't get into the conversation about pro-choice or abortion issues. We didn't get that far. I kept to kind of some of the everyday stuff because that's what the show was really about. It was about my journey. I'm not a woman who's pregnant and I'm not gay. And so, it might have felt a bit disingenuous if I'd kind of gone overboard and sort of, gone out of my way to find some controversy. I kind of, as a sort of straight white male, I just kind of gave what my experience was with that locally for me. And of course I might have left some stuff out and there would be some issues that other people might want to hear about, but I wanted to also make sure that I was giving a journey that represented the one I was going on. So that's what people get in the show.
Do you think you're going to get into some of those controversial things in the future with the show, or what do you think the future is for the next season?
I mean, I'm open to ideas. So, I mean, I'd love to hear what you guys would like to hear in the future. I mean, I'm interested in the fundamental things that I want there to be each time would be something that anyone can access. So it wouldn't be something that have too many barriers to entry. So I wouldn't do something that was necessarily completely exclusive or required a lot of money for people to do. I like the idea that, you know, if someone wanted to, technically they could kind of follow along, if that makes sense. So they could kind of say to themselves, do you know what? Actually, I hear what Tom's doing. Why don't I try that for myself? I'm not I'd like the idea of other non-believers going into church on a Sunday and just kind of leaving their beliefs at the door. Yeah. I kind of just like that, not because I want people to be converted. If they get converted, that's entirely up to them, you know. But I like the idea of people opening their minds a little bit and just finding out something new. So that would have to be something for the next series, and also something pretty local. So something that you can experience where you're at. So you don't have to get on a plane to do it, or you don't have to sort of, you know, buy yourself an expensive train ticket. It's something that you could access in your area. So things like local politics, I think would be quite interesting, which maybe then would open up some of those issues a little bit more. I like that idea for a series, but yeah, I'm interested in what you guys think. What sort of stuff you'd like to hear, you know?
Yeah, we'll keep giving you feedback on that for sure. The show's called Hiding in Plain Sight. Go check it out wherever you get your podcasts. It's just a tremendous podcast. So Tom, I'm interested in your religious upbringing. Were you born into a Christian home or a non-believing home?
Yeah, no, no one in my family spoke about God. So God was never a topic. I mean, we had a dusty Bible that was in one of the cupboards that I used to dig out because it had some pictures of like a really blonde, buff Jesus. And so I remember looking at that when I was a kid, and I'd flick through some of the stories and things like that. And so when I was really young, it was just not a thing at all. So my dad wasn't religious. Our religion was sport, and you guys don't really have it over there, but rugby's a really big thing in Wales. And so rugby was kind of like the big deal. And so all of my idols were false ones, and they were kind of Welsh rugby players and things like that. And then I went to a Catholic school at about age 10. And so my religious sort of like exposure just kind of took off, and I had a lot more exposure when I was sort of between the age of like 11 and 16 or something. So we got taught by nuns, and there was religious studies class, and so I got an understanding of some basic Christian ideas quite young, and we used to have to draw pictures of some of the stories and things like that. So coming into this experience now, sort of, you know, 20 years later after that, I kind of had some idea of what it was about, and I can remember some of the stories and some of the pictures I used to sketch out at school. But one of the surprising things for me was how little I actually knew about what the story was trying to say. And that was one of the things that I got most from it. Is I think there's a feeling for some non-believers that the Old Testament's just crazy, and the New Testament is just basically about being a good and kind person. When actually the story is actually a little bit different than that. One, there's quite a bit of wisdom in the Old Testament, and so there's some really interesting stuff. Book of Job, for example, I don't cover it in the show. I tried to find a place for it, but that was something that I really, really enjoyed reading about. And also Jesus's message is not just about being nice and good. There's a lot of other stuff going on. So I didn't quite appreciate that when I was young, until I sort of started looking at it as an adult for myself, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that there were some bugs that you had to swallow along the way. Probably the biggest one being actual belief in the God. But what are some of the sort of unattractive things that you saw within Christianity? Because, like I said, you know, you painted it all in a pretty good light on the podcast. But I'm sure there are some things that you saw that, you know, you weren't so stoked about.
Yeah, I mean, one of them, I mean, and I cover this a little bit, but sort of it may be in a slightly lighthearted way, is obviously just the believability of some of the stories. So there's an episode, I think it's episode 3, where I start like really diving into the Jesus story, and we start with the Christmas story and my sort of Christmas experience where I kind of go to church and things like that. And I guess, like, I wouldn't say I have a real issue with it, but just from a personal perspective, you know, for some Christians I met, the Christmas story is a description of actual events. And as someone coming to it a little bit cold, when you read the Christmas story, it's hard to think of it as as something that's truly believable, as if it happened step by step. So that would be one of the things that I just struggle with as someone who's non-religious. I guess is the idea of, there's that bit I think where like Zechariah just gets struck dumb by an angel. And then he comes out of his house and all his friends are like, oh, he's been struck by an angel. It's just little things that I thought was quite funny. That's the idea. If I got struck by an angel, dumb by an angel, I don't think my friends the first thing they would think was, oh, Tom's been struck dumb by an angel. There's just kind of like sort of not comedy moments, but like quite unbelievable passages to read. So I guess that's one aspect of it. But to make it more serious, I guess, by the time you get into Christianity and you get to some of the real climax of the story in the Bible, there's some real fork in the road choices it offers you. And so you get this really expansive, inclusive religion, which is remarkable in how inclusive it is in terms of the people it wants to deal with day to day. Those homeless people in our church there every day, people that I'd actually walked past every day and never spoken to, and then all of a sudden I'm speaking to them because I'm in a church. Like, church really brings people together, but at the same time there's this kind of intellectual exclusivity to it, whereby you've got to make a choice. I mean, in some ways your show is kind of like the title of your show in some ways kind of speaks to that. You got to hurry up and make a choice. You either sign up to this, you're in Jesus, or you're not. I heard that phrase a lot. You're in or you're not in. And I think so it's a very inclusive religion in one sense, but at the same time it's very exclusive. And so that's a bit of a challenge. You've got to think about what that means, both in practical terms, but obviously for me personally, that's a bug that ultimately I couldn't overcome, and I talk a little bit about that at the end.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear you say that, because that's, I think, one of the main ways that people viewed the early church in the first couple centuries. What you spoke about as far as being inclusive. The Romans said that they're quoted as saying, "You Christians take care of our poor better than we do."
Right.
And that was one of the most attractive things about the early church. However, the Christians were one of the only religious groups. I mean, the Jews were also like this, but the Christians were one of the few religious groups that said, no, you can't just add Jesus to your plurality of gods. This is exclusive in the sense that we do believe in an absolute truth that by definition excludes other claims for what reality is, and so, I mean, I think that's been something that people have struggled with throughout Christian history.
Yeah, and there was part of me that, like, at one point I thought what I was going to end on. So obviously the ending is, for anyone who hasn't heard it, obviously go away and listen to it. But it's, it's not a real final conclusion, if you like. It's a sort of like a point where I say, I've reached an ending of sorts that I'm comfortable with for now. It's not really like an end of a journey, if you like, because, it's probably something a conversation I want to keep having. But, there's a feeling, I guess, you get as a non-believer where you feel like you feel like you're outside the city walls, if you like. That image in Revelations where it paints this picture of a beautiful city of beautiful marble, and that's the sort of idea of what heaven's like. I guess that you have to feel a little bit on the outside at the end, and I guess that's the point. I mean, it's a really good idea if you don't want people just onboarding Jesus as like a philosophy. I thought I was going to argue at one point that we should maybe argue for a sort of a Christianity light, or like a diet Christianity, whereby you take some of the great philosophy, but maybe you just tone down a little bit on some of the kind of like more in-out beliefs. Right? I thought maybe I'd myself arguing for that a little bit as like a really, an interesting idea. But the more I thought about it, I think one of Christianity's strengths its strength is also its weakness. The thing that brings people together maybe is some of that exclusivity in some way, and the thing that binds people together in the middle is the thing that maybe holds people on the outside as well. So I worry that I don't think you can have one without the other. I think it's part of its DNA, and maybe it's part of its strength, but it's also maybe from a non-believer's perspective, maybe it's part of its weakness as well.
Yeah. So as you're looking at modern Christianity, besides just the bug to swallow of actually believing it, do you see negative things that Christians are contributing to culture that you would say this is not a good thing?
Yeah. As a rule, I tend to, I tend not to make too many sweeping statements. I mean, there's things that jump to mind, but they're often sort of media portrayals rather than things that I've actually experienced for myself. There's obviously there's cases going on in the UK about faith schools and funding around faith schools and things like that. I personally dislike the idea of a school being able to exclude local children based on their religious beliefs. So I'm kind of, when it comes to things like education, I don't necessarily have a problem with faith schools. I think I have a bit of an issue with schools picking children based on faith a little bit. So there's some issues like that. But I don't know if there are issues in the States, but there's certainly ones here at the minute that are problems. Maybe this is a British thing, and you guys probably don't have it because you're American and you're really confident and outgoing. But we're kind of a little bit weird and nerdy, and I struggle a little bit when people are overly apologetic, if you know what I mean, or they're talking. I'm all for people sort of saying what's on their mind and sort of speaking about Christianity like in the public square. Like I don't have an issue with that, but like sometimes you meet some people that are just really quite extreme about it. Like there's a bit of my shy side that just kind of curls up and dies a little bit. So like some of that I cringe at, but
I'm sure your issues over there are different than here. I mean, over here, our main issue is Donald Trump. So
right, yeah,
we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to go there. So I'm curious though, if you didn't have to believe that God existed and that all these miracles happened, would you want to be a Christian? Like, would you want to adopt the teachings of Jesus and enter in the community of faith if it didn't include that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you guys caught up on that. There was an episode of Unbelievable recently where it had a guy on there who was like a religious, I can't remember what the name of it was. It's like a religious fictionalist or something, which I'd never heard of before. And I thought, I wish I'd found out about that before I made the show, because it's kind of, there's some links to what I was doing. But I think there's something in incorporating religious style practices into your life. Like there's a bit in episode 2 where I sit down with a paper and pencil and confess, where I sit down for in silence for 5 minutes and I go through a confession, because I spoke to a priest called Alex and he talked to me about confession being something that he thought in his eyes as a Christian, for him, it's one of the most important things you can do, is sort of try and create a space and dialogue between yourself and God and actually confess something. So I tried that, and obviously for me, I felt like I was talking to the ceiling a little bit. But I did actually end up with, whether it's just myself, reflecting on myself, but just taking that time, it did give me pause for thought about a few different things, and it made me reflect on myself in a way that I hadn't before. I think Christians, or certainly the Christians near me, create spaces to do stuff that we don't often get in non-religious settings. So, they create time for contemplation. They create time for conversations with their friends about things like redemption. I was talking about rugby earlier. Rugby clubs are big community spaces in the UK or in Wales, where I grew up. You wouldn't go into a rugby club and have a conversation with your mate about suffering.
Yeah.
You'd get laughed out of there, or someone would be like, "What the hell?"
You guys are kind of going through it.
Yeah,
you're kind of going through some suffering after playing rugby.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you go through it on the pitch, but like if you spoke about it in your life, or like you're having a hard time, I don't think there would be that kind of common language that people would know how to respond. And I think that's something that Christians do really well, is they've got a language to actually discuss some serious life issues. And so that's another thing that I think I've tried to actually learn from a little bit in my own life. So there's elements of it. I think I would feel, to answer your question about whether I would fully onboard it, I think I'd feel slightly disingenuous to sort of label myself as a Christian. I don't think we've got that thing going on that Jews maybe have, where you can be culturally Jewish, right? In the States, I know that's quite a common thing where people call themselves Jewish, but they're not really religiously Jewish. We don't seem to have that version of it for Christianity over in the UK. I don't know if you guys have it in the States or not. So I'd feel kind of a little bit like a phony, I think, if I was to start calling myself a Christian but didn't really believe it, because everyone around you would believe it. So I think I feel a bit at odds with them in some sense.
Yeah, I had one more question, then I want to bring David in here, and this kind of ties into, I think, what David's going to share, but we're talking about the exclusivity of Christianity, and I think for us, the reason why we believe this is because we believe in absolute truth. We believe that either Jesus rose from the dead or he didn't, and that can be applied, that historic event can be applied to pretty much everything within our faith. Either this claim is true or it's not, that truth by definition excludes contrary claims. And so would you believe that religious truth is absolute in that sense, or do you sort of believe that, what's true for you is true for you and what's true for me is true for me?
As in, so like, do I believe in like an objective sort of truth?
Yes.
No, I think I probably do to some extent. I'm not some sort of moral like relativist where I think that just every opinion's as valid as the next. I think there are ways of sifting through opinions and kind of pushing the best ones to the top. I'm not sure I'd have a really good answer if you asked me where I got the grounding for that. I think if you keep on asking the why question, eventually you come to a point where you've got to start making an assumption to get off the ground a little bit. I think that's really true for non-believers, and there's a real need for that when you don't have a religion. I actually still think you probably still need an assumption to get off the ground as a religious person, but maybe you guys would be able to talk me through that a little bit and sort of let me know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of brings you into presuppositions, and there's a whole branch of apologetics called presuppositional apologetics that gets into that, but we're more evidentialists when it comes to apologetics, putting forth evidence for Christianity. And so, David, why don't you just kind of give your reasons why, you believe that it's reasonable and probable that Christianity is true?
Yeah, well, it started back in 2007, and I had what they call a crisis of faith, right? My cousin, who's an atheist, he's what they consider an academic genius, decided to sit down and ask me one big question: why should I have faith? And it launched us into a huge debate. And at the end of it, I realized, man, I didn't have any good answers for that, none, zero. And I mean, I was like, why do I believe this? And I had already given 5 years of my life to it. And I was like, man, if I'm going to believe this, I need to know not only why, but also I need to know whether it's true or not. So it launched me into years of investigation. And I basically came to a cumulative case that has evidence and everything. And the first one, and I'll just give 7 points and you can tell me what you think about it, is I think God is the best explanation of why there's something rather than nothing at all. And what I mean by that is I think arguments for chance aren't really any good. I also think God is the best explanation for the beginning of the cosmos. meaning I think the cosmological arguments are pretty sound. I also think God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the cosmos, from the initial conditions to the universe to the planetary conditions. And I even think the intelligent design movement has good explanations on the irreducible complexity in the cell. I think God is the best explanation for objective morality. I think those moral arguments are pretty strong. I think God is the best explanation for the historical reliability of the New Testament. Meaning I think the historical records show that the New Testament is true. I think God is the best explanation also for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which I think the argument for miracles and the resurrection borne out through historical inquiry is correct. Also, I think God is the best explanation that I've seen with my connection to the divine, my religious experience. And that's, that conversation and these points bore a passion in me to learn the truth and what the truth is. And that's been my inquiry even to this day. So
that's a fire hose.
Yeah, I know it's a lot of points.
We can maybe we should zero in.
But go ahead.
Maybe we should zero in on one of those. David, do you want to just pick one of those and just unpack it a little bit more?
Well, I mean, I don't want to kind of taint this show right now with and just unpacking each like one topic, right? So, I mean, this has been about religion, so I think it would be best, to hear what Tom has to say about the arguments themselves, just in an overall branch. We have different arguments that support these views. So, I mean, I think it'd be best if we start there.
Yeah, I mean,
Tom,
I'm happy to sort of make some just general comments on it for sure. Like, obviously, the thing I'd say up front for anyone listening, I have absolutely no expertise. So I'm not a scientist. I'm not an astronomer. I'm not an ancient historian. So, so all of these are sort of, bottom of the bucket opinions really. But like, obviously as a member of the public, I think it is important to at least you don't have a lot of time because you got wife and kids and a real job. I have some headspace to think about it. Yeah. So I have given, some of that stuff some thought, and I probably read a book or two in my time over the years. So, I mean, there seems to be 2 points of entry, I think, or at least I picked up that Christians seem to have 2 points of entry. And I guess if I was to become a Christian, I can imagine there's only really 2 ways in. It's you start with God and the universe and that kind of really big picture view, or you start with Jesus and the resurrection and that kind of more grounded on the worldview, and you start with him and his claims. So I guess you've got to come in at either end. The God one is tough because I think both sides of the argument, if I'm being honest, I think overplay their hand a little bit. I include the atheist sort of scientists, sort of, the ones who will throw the book of physics at you when you talk about God. I think they also overplay their hand. I'm not sure anybody really knows where universes come from. And that's my kind of view. I think we've probably got knowledge up to a point when it comes to, our universe and kind of, some of the kind of, the fundamental science behind it. And you talked about the fine tuning and stuff like that. And there was some really interesting thoughts on that. But I don't know of any sort of concrete conversation that can really nail where that stuff comes from. I think there's a big question mark there for me. And so it always feels a little bit overreaching when you hear an atheist say, oh, there definitely can't be a God because of this. And it feels a little bit overreaching for me if I hear a Christian say, well, we definitely know there is one because the universe is fine-tuned or something like that. For me, it's a horrible case of fence-sitting, which is not satisfying to anybody because everybody wants an answer, right? Everybody wants a nice, neated, packaged up answer. But I feel like, at least at this point, unless there's been a breaking news story, I don't think there is a really coherent understanding of what lies before the beginning of time. And I think it's a great mystery, and it's an interesting, question with a couple of beers for your mates. But I don't really feel like, I could put my hand on my heart and say I could buy into an idea either way on that. So I guess I'm really agnostic about that, because I just feel like it's a huge question mark.
Well, you answered like a true agnostic.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Real fence there.
Yeah. You have any questions, Titus?
Well, I mean, I want to zero in on the Clom cosmological argument a little bit, one of our favorite ones. So the basic idea is that, the universe began to exist, and whatever begins to exist needs a cause. And if we're talking about something that caused time and space itself, this something needs to be timeless and spaceless. And if we're talking about something that caused everything that's material, it needs to be immaterial. And if it can do all this, it needs to be very powerful and very wise. And before we know it, we have something that looks very much like the God that we worship, So what kind of breaks down for you in that reasoning?
I mean, you'll have heard this millions of times, and you probably got a ready answer for it. But I guess it's the instinctive feeling is, it says, in that, I guess it says that, everything that has a cause needs a cause. But I guess the logic of that for me seems to flow back endlessly. Like, then you sort of throw up the question of, well, surely, a wise, knowing God needs a cause, and then therefore what made him? And you kind of end up in a sort of infinite sort of regression of causes. And I guess then I might have heard people say, well, no, God doesn't need a cause. He's an exception to the rule because of this. Well, that's the point where I feel like it starts to really reach into describing stuff that I'm not sure what the evidence is for that, that we know that there can be such thing that doesn't require a cause to kick it off. So that's where it kind of seems to fall down into sort of a description of something that I don't know where the evidence comes for it. I don't know if there is, or there even can be evidence for something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was talking. Go ahead, David.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, yeah. I mean, the thing is like that would be special pleading if someone to say that God doesn't need a cause. Leibniz, he was the one that answered that question back in the 1600s, I believe. But he was talking about God being a necessary being. So I mean, we have good explanations of why we believe God is the starting point. And, I think it's those things that really caught me, is the explanations, having good reasons. And I think I would agree with you on some things about there's some things we don't know. But I do think there's strong evidence in favor of a God. And I mean, just for me and my exploration of it, I found those arguments to be very, very strong. And I would just encourage you to even look into them even more. I mean, when you have time, of course. I'm a parent of 3 myself, so yeah. I understand about that and working a job and stuff like that. But I mean, yeah, that was my whole point, was just to, study and study everything I could. And, when I had time and when I'm on break or where I'm, driving to work, podcasting, just any time that I could. And I mean, that's what gave me for me, a good foundation to say, I think there's more evidence in favor of this, and there's good reasons, even though we can't know something 100%. And, the Christian will never tell you that they know something 100%. We just have really good reasons why we think it's true.
Yeah, it's I guess so that particular question is really tough for a non-believer, and I'd love to know, if you could find out if someone had the stats on how many people become Christians via that route rather than the Jesus route. I'm guessing, I'm shooting from the hip here, I reckon it's probably a lot less that way than the kind of actually getting to know Jesus as a person and sort of that kind of route into Christianity. And I think the reason for that is because it feels really unobtainable. It feels really out of reach. It's hard to gather evidence for something before before time and space and everything began. And it's difficult sort of to do that through conversation. I'm not convinced conversation is the right tool for that job, because, you know, it feels like, you know, we use telescopes or whatever it is to sort of go back as far as we can to the Big Bang, and we can understand things about the early universe that way. But then to sort of ignore that and then have a conversation about what happened before it, I don't know. It feels like there needs to be more to it, maybe to be wholly convincing. But I've not heard of Leibniz before, so maybe I'll need to add that to my Christmas reading list.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and it's a good conversation. I think, you know, I mean, just to push back a little bit, I think God is a God of means, and where I would agree with you is definitely that people are going to come to Jesus through a personal experience, and that's why I added that at the end, because I think that's where, you know, I think apologetics and arguments like these and conversations, God uses as means to break down certain barriers to help us understand things better. And but yeah, I mean, I think that he could use that for people to get it, and it's probably a lot less. Like, there's probably a stat that people have done, and it probably shows that a lot less come in through apologetics. But I still think it's possible. But like I said, I think it was more for me breaking down barriers and helping solve some of my doubt.
Right.
One thing that you mentioned, David, was the idea that God is a necessary cause. And it's interesting. I was talking to my atheist friend recently, and I was asking him, you know, as far as the origins of the universe, does he believe that there had to be in a sense, a necessary cause? And what we mean by that is a cause that's not contingent upon anything else. And he said that, you know, quantum mechanics basically is that necessary cause, you know? And so I was like, okay, so we actually do sort of believe that we both do believe in a necessary cause. What if I would just call God quantum mechanics? Would you believe in him then? And he's like, well, that wouldn't get me to Christianity. And I was like, yeah, well, I'm actually not trying to get you to Christianity. At this point, and kind of what the Kalam argument does is gets you back to say that there has to be a cause that is not contingent upon anything else, and that cause needs to be immaterial and spaceless and timeless if it created everything that's material, and if it created time and space itself. And then that's kind of the foundation. And from there, like you said, we get to Jesus, and we're like, okay, there's this guy who walked the planet, who came in the tradition of Judaism, and, you know, claimed to be the God that the Jews worshipped come in the flesh. Like, he made some pretty audacious claims, and then, you know, he supposedly was raised from the dead, and then we look at the historic case. But I don't think, you know, the cumulative apologetic case for Christianity is the reason most people become Christians. Like you said, you know, it's sort of kind of what you actually experience is visiting churches, getting to know Christians, and seeing the compelling nature of this worldview, and it kind of pulls people in. And you know, even Jonathan Haidt makes that case kind of in his book, The Righteous Mind, that most people form their beliefs based on intuition and then use reasoning to defend that initial belief. So yeah, I totally get what you're saying with, you know, apologetics isn't everything, but it's sort of how we you know, prove that we're not completely throwing our brains out by accepting this worldview that we also find compelling.
I really like that reference, Jonathan Haidt. Like, I've also been sort of dipping into that a little bit recently, and that kind of the idea that he uses a really interesting image for that, right? With the guy riding on the top of an elephant, and like you're kind of emotional, and sort of maybe some of your emotional reasoning is this like wild elephant just like roaming around the jungle, and your kind of intellectual or your kind of logical self is this like little rider on the top. And it's, you know, it's the elephant who's doing most of the, as you say, like Titus, is the elephant doing most of the donkey work, and like you kind of maybe the little guy on the top who who sort of rationalizes it after the fact a little bit. So it's a nice thing to be aware of, like for people, anyone who's in sort of dialogue, because you know that sometimes what you're saying is maybe you're not saying it for the reasons that you're claiming to say it. There's other emotional things on. I mean, someone called me out on this the other day, which I don't know if you guys have a view on this. They said, in so many words, they're a bit nicer about it than this, but in so many words, they basically said, Tom, one of the reasons I think you didn't become a Christian is because you're wedded to this idea that you as an individual have the final say, and you think that individuals are where the decisions should be made, and Christians need to sort of surrender to a bigger cause. And they were basically trying to say that they didn't think I was capable of doing that, and they didn't think that I liked that idea emotionally. So I can and I've got to take that away and think about that a little bit. I mean, I've got to reflect on that and wonder whether it's not all of the fancy intelligent reasons I'm giving why I didn't become a Christian. Maybe it's something more fundamental about the what Christianity says about me losing control a little bit of my life. I don't know, but it's interesting to have that conversation.
Yeah, I think you have a very humble posture, and it's not normal to hear what you're saying from a non-believer. Usually, if a non-believer would be told that, they would be like, "Oh, come on, that's just arguing from your worldview for your worldview, But it's cool that you sort of have that posture. And one thing I would say about the compelling nature of the Christian movement is, in a sense, that actually is an evidence, although it pulls people in emotionally. I would say it is a prediction that if Jesus is the Son of God, that the worldview that bears his name is going to be compelling if God is a God of love, So, I mean, you can look at it from both ways. I would say a big reason why I'm a Christian is because of miracle claims and even seeing supernatural things happen in my own life. But that'd be a whole nother podcast to talk about some of those things. We do need to wrap things up here soon.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I one of the things that I found, if I was to sort of put my finger on one of the elements that was most compelling, like from an evidence point of view, like whilst we're on the topic about it, was kind of something you're alluding to there, Titus, is around like the sort of ridiculous popularity or appeal, if you like, of Christianity going from something that was basically a couple of people scratching around in their, in some rags in the Middle East to the most, widespread worldview on the planet. That story from a guy walking no more than 80 miles from his house, telling a few stories to his friends, and then ultimately being killed, how that story becomes probably the most famous story of all time is extraordinary. I mean, even as a non-believer, that is for me one of the most interesting things about Christianity. And I guess there's evidence within that is quite interesting to unpack about why did that happen and why did it catch fire like that. So I enjoyed sort of having some conversations with priests and Christians about that sort of stuff whilst I was doing my life experiment, because I could see why they would find that, at least some evidence for something interesting to examine, for sure.
Yeah. Great. Well, it's been great talking to you. Anything you want to say yet, David?
No, man, you guys said it all. It's good, man. Good conversation.
Tom's podcast is called Hiding in Plain Sight. Go check it out anywhere where you get your podcasts. And thanks, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you next time.